Okay, welcome to another one of my favorite lectures. This is on attention, and this comes out of Chapter 3. Now, you'll probably notice that Chapter 3 is about consciousness, but attention also follows nicely in line with sensation and perception because attention is a part of that process. And so I always like to talk about attention after we talk about sensation and perception, and especially vision, because it complements the vision lecture nicely. And you'll also find that even though our visual system may be fully intact, that it doesn't always mean that we're going to be able to pay attention to what it is that we're looking at. So, I have some big questions for you. As we go through this lecture, I want you to think about how much of the world do you actually consciously process? And so this is where attention is very much linked with consciousness. How much do you consciously process? Another question here is, how much of your behavior comes from unconscious information? And another big question, can you attend to two things at once? Or in the same type of idea, are you a good multitasker? And last, how can attention help us or fail us? Throughout this lecture, I want you to think about these questions, and by the end of the lecture, you should hopefully be able to answer these appropriately. All right, so let's talk about consciousness and its link with attention. When we think about our behavior, think about how much of our behavior is controlled by conscious decisions. Basically, how much conscious control do you have over your actions? We like to think that we have a say in every single thing that we do. But what you're going to find throughout this lecture is that much of what we do, think, or feel happens outside our conscious awareness. Also, in a scary kind of way, deliberate choices and intentions that we have are less than we actually think. And, maybe even more scary, much of what we see is actually false or just not the whole story. Our brain actually likes to fill in a lot of missing information. And then lastly, a large amount of implicit information actually has influences on our behavior, emotions, thoughts, etc. What do I mean by implicit information? I'm talking about information that comes into our brain without us having an effortful say in what's coming into our brain. It's just information that comes in that we're not really paying attention to, but that information is there, and it is very, very effective in having a say in our behavior, thoughts, emotions, and so on. And so a lot of what we do and think and feel and so on, a lot of who we are even in the world, is not all based on conscious-based, effortful decisions, based on conscious, effortful attention of things that are in the world. All right, so let's ask the question, what is attention? If you were to tell me what attention is, what would you say? What would you tell your friend? Well, let's talk about kind of attention in a broader idea. Well, first, as I mentioned already, it is a sensation and a perception process. Basically, first we have to have that sensory information come into our head, and we have to be able to perceive it, and vice versa. So if we decide to, let's say, visually attend to this lecture and use our auditory attention to this lecture, then we are taking in and we are selectively attending to that sensory information. And then when that sensory information comes into our brain, then we are going to be able to process it and then perceive what it is that we are seeing. So that's why, again, I like to talk about attention after we talk about vision and specifically, or more broadly, the sensation and perception topics. Attention can be perceived or approached through a bottom-up approach or through a top-down approach. Okay, so what is bottom-up attention? This is the type of attention that we don't really consciously or deliberately do. It's not things in our environment that we are deliberately trying to attend to. It's more things in our environment that end up getting into our brain that we don't really explicitly mean to get into our brain. And so, therefore, bottom-up attention is kind of an implicit process. And so this is kind of a lower level type of attention where things in our environment grab our attention. We maybe attend to things that we hear, and we may be attending to things that we don't even realize we're attending to. And this is something that the parietal lobe is very much involved in, which I mentioned already from the neuroscience lecture. In contrast to the bottom-up type of attention is the top-down type of attention processes. And this is the kind of attention that involves effortful processing. This is, for example, the type of attention that you would do when you are studying for an exam. You are consciously, deliberately wanting to pay attention to the task at hand. So therefore, this type of attention is explicit. So explicit and implicit are opposite. So hopefully understanding top-down attention will help you understand a little bit more what bottom-up attention is. And top-down attention appears to be more a function of the frontal lobe, especially, of course, the prefrontal cortex, because again, it's a decision-based process. And so we know decision-making and those type of explicit processes are very linked with executive functioning abilities, which are, of course, linked with the prefrontal cortex. Okay, so two different approaches that we can talk about when we talk about attention. So the bottom-up type of attention is more of that unconscious information that comes into our brain, and the top-down type of attention is more of that conscious-based information that we want to get into our brain on purpose. All right, so when I talk about top-down attention processes, I'm also referring to something called selective attention. Again, this is top-down, meaning that it is effortful, and explicit, meaning that we are deliberately making a choice to selectively attend to something. Now, how good is your selective attention? Well, it is estimated that at any given time, there are about 11 million bits of information out there in the world that we could potentially attend to. But it is estimated that we only take in consciously and deliberately about 40 of those bits. So, what this means is that much of the information that's out there in the world, we are not actively attending to. So we can also refer to selective attention as spotlight attention. This is a term that you're going to need to know. Spotlight attention, if you think about a spotlight, is a type of attention that narrows down on something and really filters out everything else outside of the spotlight. And so if you actually think about a spotlight in a theatrical production, this is a very good synonym or a very good analogy to our selective attention, because that spotlight only shows a specific area of space that we are able to explicitly see and process. And everything outside of that space, everything in the black, is outside of our awareness. And that's exactly how we can describe selective attention. So our spotlight attention is what we refer to when we're talking about selective attention. Now, our spotlight attention is also based on our foveal attention, or specifically what is coming into our eyeballs that's hitting our fovea. Now, go back a lecture to our vision lecture when we talked about the fovea and specifically the cones that are located on the fovea, and then the periphery and the rods that are located in the periphery. And again, we're talking about the area in our eye called the retina. So at the very, very back of our eye, on our retina, we have our photoreceptors. Whatever it is that we are directly looking at is hitting our fovea. And so that is, again, where all of the cones are. And that's why we can see such good detail of what it is that we are directly looking at. And we're not so good at processing detail in our periphery because there's not a lot of cones in our peripheral retina, mostly rods. And so this makes a lot of sense. We literally, physically, when we selectively visually attend to something, can only pick up the details of what it is that we're directly looking at. And we can't really physically pay attention too well to what's going on in our periphery because we are not taking in all of the details that's in our periphery. And so it's nearly physically impossible to really be able to selectively attend to, and this is specific to vision, it's very difficult or nearly impossible to selectively attend to information outside our fovea. So, this being said, we cannot attend to multiple things at the same time. How is this not possible? A lot of people tell me in this lecture, oh, I'm great at paying attention to more than one thing at a time. But let me ask you this. Can you pay attention to simply your 2 fingers at the same time? Try it. Let's go ahead and do an activity. What I want you to do is drop your pen or pencil, and I want you to put both of your fingers out in front of you. And I want you to stare at both of your fingers at the same time. So whatever it is that you're looking at is falling on your fovea. So this is your spotlight attention, visual attention. All right, so go ahead and do it for me. Can you stare at both of your fingers at the same time? What many of you may be doing right now is finding yourselves bringing your fingers closer and closer together to try to get them in the same field of view. But even though they're as close together as they possibly can be, it's still impossible to focus on both of them at the same time. What do you find yourself doing? Most of you are going to be sitting here doing this, looking back and forth at both of your fingers really quickly to try to get them in the same visual frame. But this, in a very simple way, illustrates for you that it is physically impossible to be able to visually process 2 things at once. You have to switch back and forth. And so this is exactly what happens with our attention. So we can't literally attend to more than one thing at the same time. What we can do, though, is quickly switch back and forth between the things that we are attending to. And of course, anything that's outside our spotlight, we are only going to get the gist of that information. And so that gist that's out there, sometimes it comes in correctly, sometimes it doesn't come in correctly. And so a lot of information in our peripheral attention is not very detailed, elaborate, or correct all the time. All right, so let's talk about how attention can fail us. So now what I'm going to be focusing on is more of a bottom-up type of attention. And so when we talk about attention failing us, what we're talking about is the attention that is outside of our awareness. Sometimes it helps us, but a lot of times it fails us because, again, as I mentioned, that information can be false or some of the bits and pieces are missing or so on. So when we talk about attention outside of our awareness, we can talk about this in 2 categories. One, being caused by brain damage, and then in the other category, being caused by just normal processes that you and I experience on a daily basis. Some of these we call phenomenons, plural. All right, so the 2 types of brain damage that I want to talk about that results in bottom-up attention disruption is hemispatial visual neglect and blind sight. And I just mentioned that both of these are involved in bottom-up attention processes, but they also affect, of course, very much top-down processes because the bottom-up is actually working, but the top-down is not working, and I'll explain those in a second. All right, the normal processes that we're going to talk about includes multitasking, something called inattentional blindness, and then lastly, change blindness. Hemispatial neglect happens to be one of the most interesting attention disorders that I have ever experienced, and fortunately I was able to actually spend quite a lot of time doing research in this area and working with patients who had hemispatial neglect. Now, hemispatial neglect is most often caused by a stroke, so again, this is something that's caused by brain damage. And 80% of the time, it's a result of stroke that happens in the right hemisphere. And the majority of the time, people who have hemispatial neglect have damage that results in their either parietal lobe or temporal lobe or somewhere right in between those 2 lobes. And so our right hemisphere appears to be very important for us being able to attend to information in our world, because what ends up happening when this lobe is damaged is that these patients become completely unaware of information that's going on over in their contralateral space. And what that means, contralateral means the opposite. And so what that means is when they have damage over here to their right hemisphere, their left world becomes completely absent. Now, when I say absent, I'm not talking about their visual processing has been disturbed, because we see from brain imaging data that they're very, very much taking in visual information. And their visual cortex is processing all of that information. Even higher level areas of the brain is processing that information. But that information is not getting to the final location that it needs to be in order for explicit conscious awareness to happen of that information. And so patients who have hemispatial neglect present with very fascinating symptoms. For example, if a patient with hemispatial neglect has damage in the right hemisphere, they may fail to do very simple things such as shave half of their face over on their left side. They'll shave their right side of their face but not their left side of their face because this side of their body is now being neglected. They also may only dress half of their body, specifically their right side of their body. If somebody's over in their left side talking to them, they will have no awareness of that person over there talking to them. And so I find this disorder very fascinating because the entire half side of that person's world becomes completely implicit, meaning that they no longer explicitly are aware of it, and they don't even realize that they have this syndrome occurring. Now, again, this is a disorder that illustrates how our attention can fail us, and it also illustrates how information can come into our brain, but yet we don't consciously attend to it or consciously become aware of it. But this information can still influence their behavior. So some other ways that we can see how the behavior is affected in people who have hemispatial neglect are from some drawings. And this is often one of the ways to diagnose somebody with hemispatial neglect. So if I were to show somebody a picture, and I would put it in their midline right in front of them so that the very middle of the picture was right down their nose, and so half of it on the right, half of it on their left. If I were to show a patient a picture and ask them to replicate that drawing, what we would find is that they would only be able to replicate half, specifically the right side of their drawing. And so here are some examples. So the clock drawing task is a very common task to diagnose somebody with hemispatial neglect. You ask somebody with hemispatial neglect to fill in the numbers of a clock and to sometimes even set the time to a certain time, usually a time that's over on the left side. And what you'll find is that the patient's response only provides the information that's on the right side of that clock. If I were to present a patient with a picture of a house and ask them to replicate that drawing, they would only give me half of that house. And here we see also a flower. And what we see is that the right side of the flower has been replicated, or duplicated. We don't see, however, the left side of that flower being fully complete. Now, severity does range, of course, and so there are some people who only neglect the very far side of their world, or some people who are straight right at midline from this point forward. They have no absolute idea that that world even exists. And this is purely a result of impaired top-down attention processing, that explicit attentional awareness of information over on the left side. It is not visual, again, it is attention. Another type of attention disorder is called blind sight and also caused by brain damage. And this is also an example of visual processing that occurs without conscious awareness. Now, blind sight is a result of damage in the occipital lobe now. So this is actually interesting because what does the occipital lobe do? If you remember from the neuroscience lecture, it processes vision. It processes basically low-level visual information. And so what blind sight does is disrupts the process of information coming in the bottom-up form. And so when a person has damage to their occipital lobe, what will very often happen is visual information will come into their brain. It will end up getting processed because it does end up getting routed to other areas of the brain. Remember, the brain is very plastic, especially after damage. So that visual information will still get processed, but the patient will become unaware of that visual information that they are looking at. And so there was actually a very interesting study that was conducted by Weiskrantz in 2009 that showed that patients with blind sight could actually be able to walk through their environment and miss obstacles in their way without being consciously able to perceive and attend to those obstacles. And so this is illustrated over here in the picture with a patient who, as you can see on the floor, has a lot of obstacles in his way. And this is Weiskrantz in the back following this patient, of course, to make sure he's not going to fall down or bump into anything. And so this patient, as he's walking around the hallway, is being asked, do you see anything in front of you? A person with blind sight does not have the ability to actually be able to consciously see what's in front of them. They're unable to consciously process that information, but their body can still attend to that information, and therefore these individuals with blind sight can still process the information that they're looking at without being aware of the information that they're looking at least not consciously. And so, as you can see, this person who has blind sight is able to walk down the hallway just fine without bumping into stuff in his way. Now, a person with blind sight, if I were to sit them down and show them pictures and ask them what they were looking at, they would say, I don't see anything, or I don't know what I'm looking at, almost as though they were blind. But if I were to ask them, well, okay, don't tell me explicitly what you see. Let me ask you an indirect question such as, do you think that this picture is of something that you would want to cuddle? Maybe I showed them a picture of a bunny or a kitten. They would actually be able to respond. They would be able to respond through those indirect questions because that information is actually getting into their brain without them knowing it. So implicit knowledge affecting behavior. And so blind sight as well as visual neglect shows that we do not need conscious awareness to guide our actions. Okay, so now let's move on to visual, really cool stuff, but that doesn't require brain damage. All right, so multitasking. Multitasking assumes that we can pay attention to more than one thing simultaneously. However, I already had you do this test. Could you do it? You couldn't. So multitasking is not physically possible. Try it. Literally, go back and try it. See if you've gotten any better. You can. I'm actually going to do another test for you in just a second. Now, when we try to multitask, what we end up doing is we lose efficiency with the tasks that we are trying to complete. Do this task for me now. All right, so you've already done the finger test. Now I want you to do the ABC 1, 2, 3 test. And what this test is you writing down your ABCs all the way from A to Z, and then writing your 1, 2, 3s from 1 to 26. There's 26 letters in the alphabet, so we want to match. All right, what I want you to do is time how long it takes you to write A, B, C, D all the way to Z, and then start at 1. So now switch tasks and do numbers, and then go to 1 all the way to 26. Time yourself and see how long that takes you. Go ahead and pause this video right now and do it. Just time yourself. A, B, C, D, and then 1, 2, 3. Okay, so first your ABCs and then your 1, 2, 3s. All right, pause it and now try it. Okay, so now that you've done this task, you have now a baseline time for how long it takes you to write down your ABCs and your 1, 2, 3s. Now I want you to do this task again, but instead of first doing the ABCs and then doing the 1, 2, 3s, I want you to switch back and forth. And so what I want you to do is I want you to mimic multitasking. What I want you to do is still write all of your ABCs, still write all of your 1, 2, 3s up to 26, but switch back and forth. So I want you to write A1, 2, hold on, A1, B2, C3, and so on, and get all the way to your last two things that you write being Z and then 26. So switch back and forth. So do this task again, but switch back and forth and time yourself and see how long it takes you. And then look at your times and see if there's a difference in the first task that I gave you compared to this task that I just gave you. All right, pause it and now go ahead and try this. All right, now that you're back and you're comparing times, what you should notice is that it takes you quite a bit longer to do the second part, the A1, B2, than it did to do the first part. And so what we see is that when we multitask, we are actually losing efficiency in those tasks. And so it's actually much better if you want to do a job well to focus on the one task at hand, complete it, and then move to the next task instead of trying to go back and forth. And what we see is, unfortunately, of course, there are a lot of jobs that demand us to quickly shift back and forth. And what we see is also a correlation with those type of jobs and the levels of stress. Something to think about. So instead of multitasking, this term should actually be rephrased as switch tasking, because what we're doing is we're just switching our task back and forth. All right, so let's talk about multitasking and driving, because this is something that a lot of people think that they can do. So what research shows is that, let's say when we're driving, we have 100% of our attention power, our attention brain power, on the task at hand, which is driving. fMRI studies have shown that when we are driving, again, let's say we have 100% of our brain devoted to, not 100% of our brain, but let's say 100% of those attentional resources devoted to the driving. Every time we add a task, such as talking on the phone now, every time we add a task, what fMRI research shows is that the amount of brain activity that was devoted to the driving now becomes split and gets devoted to that other task. And on average, we see a reduction by 37% of our attentional brain resources in the driving task that now goes on to the other task. And with each additional task that we add on to that, we continue to reduce our brain attention resource to the first task that we're doing, which was driving. Keep that in mind with every single thing that you're doing in the car at the same time. What research also shows is that we are more likely to be at risk for an accident when we are talking on the phone and driving. Specifically, we are at an increased rate of accidents by 28%. This is matching our risk for being in an accident at a 0.08 blood alcohol level. And so we're getting up there in drunkenness factors and the risk with being on the road driving drunk and the risk of being on the road while just talking and driving. There is a video link here that right now I would like you to go ahead and link to and watch. It's a 7-minute video clip that comes out of National Geographic. And I'm not going to play it here because National Geographic keeps they keep blocking my videos for using their videos. So you do need to link to this though and watch it because you are actually getting quizzed on some of the content that comes out of this video. So watch that video and then come back. All right, what this video also showed is that texting while driving is, of course, even more dangerous. What research shows is that texting while driving doubles the risk of accidents from talking on the phone and driving. And what we see is that text talking and driving happens to be more of a risky behavior than drunk driving. So we see an even more risk to driving and texting than we see when somebody is actually legally drunk driving. Unfortunately, there are polls in the United States that state that at least 1 out of 3 people admit to texting. And this isn't just limited to teenagers. This includes adults and even older adults as well. And so what this means is at any given time, you can expect on the road to have 1 out of every 3 drivers around you texting and driving. And so this is something to keep in mind, not only for you to not text and drive, but to be aware of others on the road that are also texting and driving, because there are unfortunately a lot of them out there, even with the laws that we have in place. Now, research also shows that when we are distracted by talking on the phone, that we are way more likely to miss or to not complete our task at hand of the driving, such as getting off at the appropriate location. Let's say getting off at our exit on a highway. And so research studies, as the ones that I'm describing, show that we are way more likely to miss an exit when we are on our phone, even when we are reminded that our exit is coming up. So even with that reminder, we still fail to pay attention to what's going on to the task at hand, such as driving, when we are distracted by talking on the phone. So very important things to think about when you are in the car and making a decision to talk or text. All right, inattentional blindness. Inattentional blindness is a super cool phenomenon that occurs to everybody more often than we think. And what this refers to is the attention of information outside our spotlight causes us to fail to attend to that information outside our spotlight. And so basically, we become blind to things that we're not attending to. Now, interestingly, we have something within this phenomenon called the expectation factor. meaning that we are much more likely to miss something or not attend to something or process something or be aware of something in our environment that we don't expect to see. This is why inattentional blindness and the expectation factor, this is why there is such a high rate of motorcycle accidents on the road. Now, this isn't the only reason why there's a high rate of motorcycle accidents on the road. This is a huge contributor, though. And so what is going on with this high rate of motorcycle accidents is the fact that there are drivers in cars that when they look around and, let's say, change lanes or to back up or to move forward or whatever it is that they're doing, when they look around, they're not expecting to see a motorcycle because, well, it's not something that is as common on the road as cars are. And so when people are not expecting to see a motorcycle around them, then they literally fail to attend and be aware that there is a motorcycle around them. So as a result, a lot of motorcycle accidents are caused by drivers in cars that hit the motorcyclists because they really just didn't see them, because they did not attend to that motorcyclist. And this is why you see a lot of billboard signs and even bumper sticker signs that say, "Look twice, save a life." What does that refer to? That refers to when you are looking around to change lanes or maneuver your car, doing whatever it is that you're doing, don't just look for cars, but also look for things that you don't expect. People on bicycles, motorcyclists, and so on. Because, again, if we're not expecting to see something, we're more likely to miss it. All right, now before I continue any further, let me actually show you a video that will better demonstrate what basketball. At the end of this, I'm going to see who's right because I know the number of times the basketball was passed with those wearing the white shirts. All right, are you ready? All right, so hopefully that gave you a good description and experience of what inattentional blindness is. Now, that video is actually a modified replication from the original study conducted by Neisser in 1979. And this study entailed showing participants a basketball game, much like you just saw before, but throughout the basketball game, they had a female walk through the basketball game with an umbrella. When she got to the middle of the court, she stopped, she opened up her umbrella, then she closed it, and then she kept walking to the other side of the court. After the experiment, participants were asked if they noticed this woman carrying the umbrella, and half of the participants said they did not notice. Now, this was conducted in 1979, and this was a very fascinating result that half the people didn't notice a female walking through a basketball game carrying an umbrella. Obviously, this isn't something that you see every day. But even though it was very fascinating, not everybody was sold that this is actually a real phenomenon. And so this is why Simons and Chabris in 1999 decided to replicate the study, but instead of just having something as simple as a person carrying an umbrella, they decided to up the ante a little bit. And what they ended up doing, as you just saw, was inserting a mascot gorilla through the basketball game. And what they found was the exact same result, and that was half the participants did not notice. So what inattentional blindness is when we fail to be aware of information that's really directly in front of us. And so we are unaware of that information. even though it may be right there in front of us. Now, there have been, of course, many more replications of the study because it's such a cool type of attention thing that we all experience. And one of those other replications, for example, a more recent one was in 2010 by Hyman. And in this study, there was a clown on a unicycle that was actually cycling around campus. And as he cycled past people, they were asked, did you notice a clown on a bicycle, or I'm sorry, a unicycle? And interestingly, in 2010, in this study, 75% of the students that were on a phone did not notice that there was a unicycle clown riding around them. Now, what does this mean? Well, as we increase our use of technology and our distractions in the environment, we are going to experience inattentional blindness a whole lot more in our environment. Something to think about as you're sitting on campus one day. You might miss that clown riding around on a unicycle. All right, the other type of very interesting attentional phenomenon is called change blindness. Now, change blindness is the type of attention failure that occurs when we fail to attend something that has happened right in front of us that changed. And so basically what this means is that a change that has occurred right in front of us, we fail to notice. And this can occur even when we're looking directly at that changing scene. Now, this also illustrates the idea of out of sight, out of mind. And it most often happens when we are switching attentional focus. And so when we're doing that multitasking, for example, when we're switching back and forth, this is very often when change blindness occurs. Now, here is a scary fact about change blindness, and that is we think we'll notice the change if we're told to expect it, but the results show even if we're told that something's going to change in our environment, 50% of the time we still fail to notice it. And so we see the same rates as we see with inattentional blindness, and that is when things change directly in front of us, 50% of the time we fail to notice it. And this is something that movie producers really go off of when they are doing their movie edits. And so let me actually show you a fun video. This is a fun spin-off of Simons and Chabri's desk experiment. And so here you see Simons and Chabris again. They actually are two of the most famous researchers in this field of attention phenomenons. And they created another very famous experiment called the desk experiment, where participants came up to a desk, talked to a researcher, the researcher ducked behind the desk, another person popped up, and half the time the participants did not even realize it was a new person. And so this study, as cool as it is, has been replicated many times. And so let me show you another video that illustrates this situation of people switching behind a desk.
Remember the Wizard of Oz? You know, Dorothy and her famous ruby red slippers? Did you just notice anything weird? That she wasn't wearing those red slippers in that scene? Right there. In Pretty Woman, 1 minute Julia Roberts is eating a croissant, the next, a pancake. It's a dirty little secret Hollywood's been relying on for years. Something called change blindness, which means most of us will never notice their unintentional little slip-ups. My favorite movie, Top Gun. Tom Cruise with no shades, man hug. Shades appear. Carrying on the Top Gun theme, today we're on board the aircraft carrier the Intrepid to test this incredible theory that human brains are wired to often not notice changes that unfold before our very eyes. Michael from Pennsylvania thinks he's here to just answer some questions about memory.
So in terms of observation, what were you doing exactly this time yesterday?
We were driving to New Jersey for sushi.
Okay, what did you have for lunch the day before yesterday?
We skipped lunch, had a light Mexican.
Light Mexican. Very nice.
You passed the test. Thank you so much. You qualify for a free t-shirt, Michael?
Now our experiment really begins.
We give you a t-shirt.
You look more like a extra large kind of guy.
Yeah, just about.
He has no idea what just happened. Do you?
Please fill it out.
You look more like a extra large kind of guy.
Mark, our producer, and Scott just switched places.
Have you noticed anything weird going on, Michael?
No.
Really? Scott being nice to you?
Yes.
Yeah. How about the other guy? Remember him?
No.
Now remember, we're asking them about memory, so they're thinking about memory. Surely they're hyper-aware. This is Nicholas, sailor in the Swedish Navy. Claims he's good at remembering faces.
Let me get you a t-shirt.
Yeah, thanks. You size large?
Yeah, I think so.
Have you noticed anything odd happened? Nothing out of the ordinary.
Not really, no.
No?
It feels like I should have, but
Did you notice that somebody else gave you the form to begin with? That guy?
no, because I'm pretty sure it was him. It wasn't. Really?
He didn't notice. A lot of people don't notice. Turns out we all suffer change blindness in one form or another because our brains just can't process everything we see. Did you notice that? What about kids? They have the attention span of goldfish, right? Cell phones, texts, who will be their prom date, all that stuff. Callista here is 15, Amber is 30.
Now, you guys are quite young. You must have good memories, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
What was my name?
Nick.
Finally, someone remembers.
Do you remember faces more or do you remember names?
Photographic memory.
Really?
That's a bold statement. Will that photographic memory lose focus at our change blindness kiosk?
What size t-shirt, you guys?
Do you have youth large?
Yeah, let me see.
Do we size this? Or mom?
We have small, not youth large. Is that gonna be an issue?
Yeah, Tim, the other guy.
Huh?
Yeah, what?
Other guy?
Is everything all right?
That's not the same guy. Where's the other guy that we were talking to? I don't.
What was it? Was it the beard?
They just look so much different.
Exactly. And here's the sad truth. Change blindness gets worse as we get older because, well, we lose an average of 100,000 brain cells every day.
May I ask how old you are?
75.
Can you fill this out? What size shirt do you wear?
Well, I would like large. I might give it to my great-grandson.
You said large, right?
Yes, please. You only want our age if we're a minor?
I believe you're above the age.
She's blind to the change.
Good-looking young gentleman.
He is a good looking.
Nice. Like,
Is he better looking than the other guy?
than you?
Than the other guy?
I didn't
That
see
guy?
Oh,
That guy.
I didn't see that guy. I'm not observant.
Most people don't get it.
7 out of 13 people we tested fell for it, did not notice the switch. So next time you're watching a movie, try really hard to pay attention, to notice the mistakes. Like in Spider-Man, Peter slings a web and smashes a lamp. Seconds later, a miracle, it's back in one piece. You might never enjoy a movie the same way again. We're sorry.
Alright, so hopefully that was a fun video that showed better what change blindness is and just how susceptible people are to this phenomenon. If you're interested in another video, here is another link to a National Geographic Brain Games video that actually tests how good your ability is to detect the changes that are around you. Alright, so this brings us to the end of our lecture. And let's just recap some of those big questions that I had for you at the beginning of the lecture. One of those being, how good is your attention? Let me talk about something called the bias effect in a minute, but let me point out that you probably thought that your attention was a little bit better before we went through this lecture. So, one of the questions that I asked you was, can you attend to more than one thing at a time? Do you know the answer to that? Another question was, can you multitask? You should know the answer to that too. And then lastly, how much of your world do you consciously process and how much are you aware of? Well, let's answer these questions. You should know that you cannot attend to more than one thing at a time. You should also know that physically you can't multitask, and when we try, we lose efficiency, but we can switch our attentional focus back and forth. And then, as far as what we consciously process in the world, we don't do so much of conscious, explicit attending in our world, a lot more of the bottom-up, unconscious, implicit processing. So what is the bias effect? Well, this is, again, like I said, something that you probably had at the beginning of this lecture, and that is that we think our attention skills are a lot better than they actually are. Now, this brings me to my last question that I have for you. and that is, throughout this lecture, did you notice that I switched my shirt 3 times? This is your discussion board question. Now, don't ruin it for others who have not seen the lecture yet. Specifically, don't tell anyone if you saw the 3 shirts that's what you saw. I just want you to describe that you either knew or you did not know that I changed my shirt. First I had on a multicolored shirt, and then a pink shirt, and now a red shirt. If you noticed, describe maybe why you noticed. Again, without spilling details. If you didn't notice, explain why you didn't notice. And begin your discussion board forum. Again, you have a quiz after this lecture is over, and if you're interested, here are a lot more links to more fun videos on attention, because this is such a cool topic. A lot of fun stuff for you to explore. All right, thank you so much, and this is the end of our module. See you next time.